The infrared feed flickered across 3 different command centers simultaneously, each one watching the same nightmare unfold in real time. 47 Navy SEALs, call sign Trident Actual, were pinned in a horseshoe canyon in northeastern Afghanistan, taking fire from positions they couldn't flank, couldn't suppress, and couldn't escape. The Taliban had learned from 15 years of mistakes. They'd studied American tactics, memorized drone patterns, and waited for weather that grounded the Apache. This wasn't opportunistic contact. This was a planned kill box, and the men inside it had approximately 11 minutes of ammunition remaining before the outcome became inevitable. At Bagram, a colonel with 28 years of service stood silent, watching tracers arc into American positions from 3 sides. At CENTCOM Forward in Qatar, a 2-star general asked the question nobody wanted to answer. At Creech Air Force Base in Nevada, a Reaper pilot watched through a camera he couldn't weaponize, the missiles already expended on a target 30 miles prior. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. America had the most sophisticated military in human history, and 47 of its most elite warriors were about to die because of weather, timing, and geography. The voice that answered the emergency tasking came through with a clarity that seemed wrong for how much static surrounded it. Bagram Control, Hawkeye 7-1, I'm 3 minutes out from your coordinates, requesting immediate clearance into the canyon space, over. The controller's eyes went to his screen, then his supervisor, then back to his headset with confusion that bordered on disbelief. Hawkeye 7-1 wasn't on the air tasking order. Hawkeye 7-1 wasn't supposed to exist in this airspace at this time. More importantly, Hawkeye 7-1 was a single-ship A-10 Thunderbolt, and A-10s didn't fly solo combat missions into contested mountain terrain during active troops-in-contact situations without forward air controllers, pre-planned coordination, and about 6 layers of approval this pilot definitely didn't have. The controller's hand hesitated over his radio. Hawkeye 7-1, say intentions and mission authority. There was a pause, not long, maybe 2 seconds, but in that gap, another burst of gunfire echoed through the Reaper's audio feed. When the voice came back, it carried something the controller would remember for the rest of his career. Not anger, not defiance, just certainty. Bagram, my intention is close air support. My authority is that Americans are dying, entering canyon space in 90 seconds. Hawkeye 7-1 is in hot. The colonel at Bagram made a decision that would either end a career or define it. All aircraft, canyon airspace is now restricted. Hawkeye 7-1, you are cleared hot, Godspeed. What nobody in any command center knew yet was that Captain Iris Vane had been flying A-10s for 9 years, that she'd logged more combat hours than most pilots saw in full careers, or that her call sign wasn't Hawkeye 7-1 by assignment. It was Hawkeye 7-1 because she'd been number 71 in her academy class, and Hawkeye because during her first combat deployment, she'd identified hostile positions from altitudes and angles that made forward air controllers stop trusting their own eyes and start trusting hers. She'd been returning from a reconnaissance tasking, fuel state adequate but not comfortable, when the emergency broadcast cut through every frequency. She'd switched her mission computer, reprogrammed her approach, and pointed her aircraft at a canyon she'd never seen before, carrying ordnance she'd already planned to bring home unused. Her jet was older than most officers in the Tactical Operations Center. The airframe had been built when her father was in high school. The titanium bathtub surrounding her cockpit had absorbed small arms fire on 4 continents. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon mounted in its nose carried 1,100 rounds of 30mm hate, and Iris Vane intended to deliver every single one with the precision of a surgeon and the mercy of a landslide. The SEALs heard it before they saw it. That sound, the one that doesn't exist anywhere else in modern warfare, the deep turbofan growl of twin General Electric TF-34 engines pushing a weapons platform that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated beauty and loved function. Lieutenant Marcus Briggs, Trident Actual, was on his 3rd magazine, firing controlled pairs at muzzle flashes he could barely distinguish from shadows. His radio operator was wounded. His medic was treating two casualties simultaneously. His breacher was down to a sidearm. They'd called for fire support 17 minutes ago and been told weather had everything grounded. They'd called for immediate extract and been told the nearest birds were 40 minutes out. They'd stopped calling after that, because talking used air they needed for fighting, and everyone in the canyon knew how this math worked. Then that sound rolled across the rocks like thunder with intent, and Marcus risked a glance upward just as an A-10 thunderbolt materialized through cloud cover, so low, it seemed to be wearing the weather instead of flying through it. Iris saw the battlefield in layers. Thermal imaging showed her friendly positions clustered in a defensive perimeter, tight and disciplined despite the circumstances. She saw muzzle flashes from elevated positions forming a horseshoe exactly as described. She saw the kill zone, the approaches, the dead space where her ordnance would accomplish nothing except wasting time nobody had. Her targeting computer painted solutions. Her heads-up display fed her airspeed, altitude, angle of attack. Her hands moved across controls with economy of motion that looked effortless because it was practiced 10,000 times until effort became irrelevance. Trident Actual, Hawkeye 7-1, I have visual on your position. I need talk on for hostile concentrations, over. Marcus's voice came back rough with dust and adrenaline. Hawkeye Trident, we have Papa November Delta, danger close all quadrants, heavy contact from elevated north, northeast, and eastern ridge positions. Request immediate suppression. We are Winchester on options here. Iris's jaw tightened. Danger close meant the enemy was within 600 meters of friendly forces. In a canyon with complicated terrain and thermals that turned predictable ballistics into prayer, danger close meant every round she fired carried the risk of killing the men she was trying to save. She rolled her aircraft, bleeding airspeed, positioning for a gun run that defied the standard approach profiles they taught her at Nellie's. The A-10 wasn't designed for grace. It was designed to absorb punishment and deliver devastation, to fly low and slow through hell and come home ugly but functional. Iris had long ago made peace with the fact that her aircraft would never win beauty contests, but in moments like this, watching her weapon systems align with targets that needed killing, she'd never flown anything more beautiful in her life. Her finger moved to the trigger. The GAU-8 came alive with a sound like industrial fabric tearing across the sky. 70 rounds per second, each one the size of a beer bottle, depleted uranium penetrators that treated rock formations and fortified positions as minor inconveniences. She walked her fire across the northern ridge with corrections so precise her targeting data would later be used in training manuals. Hostile positions evaporated, not suppressed, not scattered, evaporated. The Taliban fighters who'd been so confident in their ambush geometry suddenly understood they weren't fighting soldiers anymore. They were being hunted by something that flew like a bird and struck like an avalanche. Marcus watched earth and stone explode along the ridge line, watched firing positions that had been untouchable for 20 minutes cease to exist in clouds of pulverized rock and worse. Hawkeye, Trident, that's good effects. Shifting fire to northeast positions. Still heavy contact eastern ridge. Iris was already banking, her aircraft responding with the heavy grace of something that understood its purpose. She'd burned 400 rounds. She had 700 remaining, and 3 distinct target clusters that needed attention. The math was adequate if she didn't miss. She never missed. Her next run came from a different vector, altitude even lower, airspeed pushing the edge of controllable. The canyon walls rose on either side close enough that she could see individual striations in the rock, close enough that her wingtips seemed to threaten geology. Anyone watching from the ground saw an aircraft that appeared to be carving through space it had no business occupying, flown by someone who'd either calculated the physics perfectly or didn't care about survival. Iris had calculated everything. She always did. The northeastern positions received the same treatment as the north. Precision violence, delivered with the kind of accuracy that made experienced soldiers stop thinking about luck and start considering skill. But the eastern ridge was different. The eastern ridge had firing positions dug into reverse slopes, angles that required her to approach from directions that exposed her to ground fire from every survivor she just created. Standard doctrine said don't do it. Standard doctrine said request additional assets, establish suppression, approach from safer vectors. Standard doctrine was written by people who weren't watching 47 Americans bleed out in real time. Iris pointed her nose at the eastern ridge and committed to an approach that would later be described in after-action reports with words like inadvisable and exceptional circumstances and unprecedented. She saw the tracers before she felt them. Green lines reaching up through dusty air, searching for her aircraft with intentions that required no translation. The A-10's titanium bathtub was legendary, but legendary didn't mean invincible. It meant you could absorb punishment that would kill other aircraft and keep fighting long enough to complete the mission before you worried about landing. She felt one impact, then another, the airframe shuddering with hits that her damage control systems registered and categorized. Hydraulic pressure holding, flight controls responsive, engines operating nominal. She was still flying, which meant she was still fighting. The GAU-8 spoke again, and the Eastern Ridge learned the same lesson as its companions. You could hide from drones. You could wait out helicopters. You couldn't hide from a pilot who'd memorized her weapon's parameters so completely that targeting became instinct, who understood her aircraft's capabilities at a level that erased the boundary between machine and intention. Iris pulled out of her run, airframe protesting, warning lights suggesting concerns her training said acknowledge, but don't obey yet. She'd expended 900 rounds. She had 200 remaining, and the tactical frequency was reporting friendly casualties who needed medical evacuation immediately. The canyon was too narrow for helicopters. The weather still had everything else grounded. Marcus's voice cut through her combat calculus. Hawkeye, Trident, you just saved 47 lives. Contact is broken. We have urgent surgical casualties. Request you coordinate immediate CASEVAC over. Iris looked at her fuel state, her damage indicators, the weather that wasn't improving. She looked at the canyon walls and the space between them and the training that said A-10s don't land in unimproved hostile territory. She looked at all of it and made a decision that would become legendary for reasons that had nothing to do with the gun runs. Trident, Hawkeye, understand urgent surgical. Be advised I am landing in Canyon to provide emergency medical transport. Recommend you mark secure LZ over. The radio went silent. Not dead silent. The kind of silent that happens when someone says something so completely unexpected that it requires recalibration of reality. Marcus keyed his radio twice, unsure he'd heard correctly, then found his voice. Hawkeye, say again your last transmission. Iris was already configuring for landing, running calculations in her head faster than her computer could process them. Trident, I said I'm landing. I've got 2 seats and you've got wounded. Do the math and mark me a space. Hawkeye is inbound for landing, 30 seconds. What happened next would be analyzed in aviation safety courses, studied by military historians, and debated by pilots for decades. Iris Vane put an A-10 Thunderbolt down in a canyon space that measured barely 300 meters of usable terrain, scattered with rocks that could destroy landing gear, on a surface that had never been surveyed for load-bearing capacity, in weather that still had conventional aircraft grounded, with battle damage that hadn't been fully assessed, at an altitude that made her engines gasp for air. And she did it with the calm precision of someone parking a car in their driveway. The landing gear absorbed impact that should have collapsed it. The brakes screamed against momentum that wanted to carry her into canyon walls. The airframe shuddered, settled, and stopped with 40 meters to spare. Iris popped her canopy and looked back at SEALs who were staring at her aircraft like it had just violated several laws of physics and possibly 1 or 2 of theology. I can take 2, she called out, her voice carrying over dying engines. Who needs out most urgently? Marcus was already moving, directing his team with hand signals, identifying the casualties whose survival measured in minutes rather than hours. 2 SEALs, both with wounds that required surgical intervention immediately, were carried to the A-10 with the kind of desperate care that erases boundaries between careful and fast. Iris helped secure them in the cockpit spaces that were never designed for this purpose, using cargo straps and first aid supplies to create makeshift restraints that would have made flight surgeons weep. She looked at Marcus, dirt and blood across his face, exhaustion and relief fighting for dominance in his expression. "The rest of your team," Marcus gestured to the canyon. "Birds are inbound now, weather's breaking. We'll be out in 20 minutes thanks to you buying us time." Iris nodded, already running her pre-flight mental checklist for a takeoff that was going to be even more interesting than the landing. "Tell them Hawkeye sends her regards." She sealed the canopy, fired up engines that were probably wondering what they'd done to deserve this kind of treatment, and began a takeoff roll that used every available meter and several that probably weren't. The A-10 clawed into the air with the grace of a freight train achieving flight, carrying 2 wounded warriors and 1 pilot who just redefined what close air support meant. At Bagram, controllers watched her climb out of the canyon and exhaled breaths they hadn't realized they'd been holding. At CENTCOM, the 2-star general made a note to personally review this pilot's record. At Creech, the Reaper pilot recorded video that would become the most-watched classified footage in modern military aviation. Nobody spoke immediately. What Iris Vane had just accomplished existed in that rare space between impossible and inevitable, where skill and courage conspired to make the unreasonable look routine. She flew her damaged aircraft back to Bagram, landed with hydraulics that were failing but functional, and taxied to the medical staging area where surgical teams were already waiting. She helped extract the casualties, provided brief statements to the operations officers who needed information for their reports, and walked away before anyone could properly process what they'd witnessed. In the following hours, as the full SEAL team was extracted and the canyon was secured, the story began to spread. Not officially, not through channels, but the way all important stories spread in military communities warrior to warrior, told with the kind of reverence reserved for actions that transcend duty and approach legend. Captain Iris Vane, who'd been flying alone on what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission, had heard Americans in trouble and responded with violence that was both overwhelming and precise. She delivered close air support in conditions that grounded other aircraft. She'd landed in terrain that shouldn't support landing. She'd extracted casualties under circumstances that rewrote operational assumptions. And she'd done it all with radio communications so calm they sounded bored, as if turning impossible situations into resolved problems was just another Tuesday for Hawkeye 7-1. The SEALs who'd been in that canyon became the story's most devoted evangelists, telling anyone who'd listen about the A-10 that appeared through clouds like divine intervention with a GAU-8. The official after-action report used careful language, acknowledging tactical success while noting several deviations from standard procedure that required review. The unofficial response was different. It was Master Chief Anderson, 32 years in naval special warfare, who said what everyone was thinking when he stood in the Bagram Operations Center and announced to everyone present, "I don't care what your regulations say. That pilot just did something I've never seen in 3 decades of this work, and if anyone in this command even thinks about second-guessing her decisions, they can explain their reasoning to 47 SEALs who are breathing because she made them." The room went quiet. Anderson wasn't known for speeches or sentiment. He was known for results and for understanding violence in all its applications. When he spoke, people listened. "What's her name?" someone asked. Anderson looked at the operations log. "Captain Iris Vane, Hawkeye 7-1. He said it like he was memorizing it, committing it to the mental catalog of names that mattered, warriors who'd proven themselves in circumstances that separated pretenders from professionals. Iris wasn't in the operations center. She was in the maintenance hangar, standing beside her A-10 while crew chiefs assessed damage that made experienced mechanics shake their heads in disbelief. 7 hits. Small arms fire that had penetrated non-critical systems, damaged hydraulic lines, fractured a fuel sensor, and generally treated her airframe like a practice target. The crew chief, a technical sergeant named Ramirez with 21 years maintaining attack aircraft, walked around the plane twice before speaking. "Ma'am, with respect, you shouldn't have been able to fly this back, let alone land it successfully." Iris touched one of the bullet holes, feeling the torn metal, thinking about the Taliban fighter who'd fired this specific round and how close he'd come to changing outcomes. "The jet kept flying, Ramirez. That's what A-10s do. They take hits and keep fighting." Ramirez looked at her, then at the aircraft, then back at her. "That's what A-10s do, Captain, but landing in an unsecured canyon to pull out casualties, that's what you did. That's different." Word reached the medical facility where the 2 SEALs were already in surgery. Both would survive, both would eventually return to operational status, and both would carry scars that came with stories they'd tell for the rest of their lives. The story of Hawkeye 7-1, who'd appeared when they needed her most and stayed until the job was finished. One of them, a petty officer named Sullivan, would later track down Iris's contact information and send her a message that she'd keep in her personal files forever. "You didn't know me. You didn't owe me. You risked everything for strangers because it needed doing. That's not duty. That's something bigger. Thank you for my life." Iris would read that message on dark days, days when the bureaucracy felt suffocating, and the missions felt repetitive, and the question of whether any of it mattered became too loud to ignore. She'd read it and remember that sometimes it mattered in ways that couldn't be quantified, measured, or captured in performance reviews. The squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Briggs, no relation to the SEAL lieutenant, called Iris into his office the next morning. She'd expected this conversation, prepared for it with the same attention to detail she brought to mission planning. Briggs was career Air Force, a by-the-book officer who'd risen through ranks by following procedures and expecting others to do the same. He looked at the after-action report, then at Iris, then back at the report with an expression that suggested he was navigating between conflicting instincts. "Captain Vane," he began, voice carefully neutral, "your actions yesterday saved American lives. That's indisputable. They also violated about 6 different operational protocols, risked a multi-million-dollar aircraft in unauthorized circumstances, and created command complications that are still being sorted out." Iris stood at attention, saying nothing, waiting for the verdict that would determine whether she'd be decorated or court-martialed. Briggs continued, "I'm required to document all deviations from approved procedures. I'm also required to acknowledge exceptional performance under combat conditions." He closed the folder. "Here's what's going to happen. Officially, you'll receive a letter of counseling for unauthorized airspace entry and unapproved landing in hostile territory. Unofficially, that letter is going in a file that nobody will ever read because I'm also recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the admiral who commands all special operations in this theater has personally requested to meet you to express his gratitude." Iris allowed herself the smallest smile. "Understood, sir." Briggs leaned back in his chair, the by-the-book commander momentarily replaced by a pilot who remembered what combat felt like. "Between us, Captain, what you did was either incredibly brave or incredibly reckless, and I honestly can't determine which. What I can determine is that 47 SEALs went home because of your decisions, and in the end, that's the only math that actually matters. Dismissed." Iris saluted, turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Sir, permission to speak freely." Briggs nodded. "Those men were dying. I had weapons and fuel and a runway that happened to be unconventional. The math was simple." The story didn't stay contained in Afghanistan. Stories like this never do, especially in an era when information moves at digital speed and warriors talk to warriors across continents in real time. Within 48 hours, pilots at Nellis Air Force Base were discussing the canyon landing. Within 72 hours, Instructors at the Air Force Academy were using it as an example in case studies about decision-making under pressure. Within a week, someone had leaked partial helmet camera footage that showed the landing from the perspective of the SEALs on the ground, and that video became the most shared piece of military content in recent memory. Iris watched it once, saw herself through their eyes, an A-10 descending into impossible space with impossible confidence, and understood why people were treating her differently. She'd become a symbol of something larger than individual achievement. She'd become proof that sometimes the impossible was just the improbable executed with sufficient skill and courage. But symbols don't get to be human, and Iris was discovering that fame, even military fame, came with complications that marksmanship and airmanship couldn't solve. Pilots who'd never spoken to her before suddenly wanted to share coffee and conversation. Officers senior enough to ignore her previously now found reasons to seek her input on tactical discussions. The attention was uncomfortable not because she was modest. Iris knew exactly how skilled she was, but because it reduced everything to a single action, erasing the 9 years of experience, the thousands of flight hours, the endless training that had made that single action possible. She'd been good before Afghanistan. She was the same person after. The only difference was now everyone else noticed. She handled it the way she handled most things, with economy of words and efficiency of action. Thank you for the recognition. Yes, I'd make the same choices again. No, I wasn't scared, I was busy. The answers were true and incomplete in the way that all simple truths are incomplete. 3 weeks after the canyon, Iris flew her 60th combat mission in theater, a routine close air support tasking that involved no landing in hostile terrain and no last-minute heroics. It was exactly the kind of mission she'd flown dozens of times before the canyon, competent and professional and forgotten by everyone except the ground forces who appreciated her precision. She preferred it this way. The spectacular was satisfying, but the consistent was where wars were actually won, where professionals proved themselves day after day in circumstances that would never generate headlines or helmet camera footage. After she landed and debriefed, she found a message waiting from Marcus Briggs, the SEAL lieutenant from the canyon. He tracked her down through channels, wanted to buy her a drink if she ever made it stateside, wanted to say thank you in person rather than through radio communications and official reports. Iris wrote back, "No thanks necessary. You were doing your job, I was doing mine. The overlap worked out well for everyone. Stay safe out there." Marcus would later tell people that response was the most Hawkeye thing he'd ever read. Competence without arrogance, confidence without theatrics, just a professional acknowledging that good outcomes required everyone doing their part with excellence. But he also kept that message, because underneath the casual tone was something he recognized from his own experience in special operations. The understanding that some missions transcend routine, that some actions carry weight beyond their tactical results, that some days you're called to be more than just competent, and you either answer that call or live with the knowledge that you didn't. Iris had answered. She'd answered with precision and violence, and a willingness to risk everything for strangers she'd never met and would likely never see again. That wasn't just professionalism. That was warrior culture in its purest form, the ancient code that said you protect those who fight beside you, even if beside you means they're on the ground and you're in the sky, and you've never shared a word outside of combat radio frequencies. The Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony happened at Bagram, attended by more senior officers than Iris had ever seen in one room. The admiral who commanded special operations read the citation, his voice carrying across the assembled formation with the kind of gravity that comes from understanding exactly what actions the words were describing. For extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight as an A-10 pilot, Captain Iris Vane distinguished herself by heroism and exceptional aerial skill during close air support operations in support of ground forces under heavy enemy contact. The citation continued, detailing the gun runs, the landing, the casualty evacuation, each sentence documenting actions that had seemed inevitable in the moment but impossible in retrospect. When the admiral pinned the medal to her uniform, he leaned in and spoke quietly enough that only Iris could hear. "My men tell me you're the best combat pilot they've ever worked with. Coming from SEALs, that's not a compliment they give lightly. Thank you for bringing them home." Iris saluted, accepted congratulations from officers who'd materialized for the ceremony, and returned to her quarters feeling exactly as she had before, competent, professional, and eager to return to the work that mattered more than recognition. The medal was significant. She understood its meaning, valued the acknowledgement it represented. But it was also just a piece of metal documenting a single day in a career that she hoped would span decades. And she'd learned long ago that the warriors who obsessed over decorations often missed the point entirely. You didn't fly missions for medals. You flew them because people needed support, and you had the skills and equipment to provide it. Everything else was administrative detail, important for records but irrelevant to the fundamental question of whether you could perform when performance mattered. She'd proven she could. The canyon had confirmed what she already knew about herself. Now it was time to return to proving it in circumstances that wouldn't generate ceremonies or citations, just results. The months following the canyon blurred together in the way that deployment months always do, a succession of missions that varied in detail but shared fundamental patterns. Provide overwatch for ground forces. Suppress enemy positions when requested. Return to base, debrief, eat, sleep, repeat. Iris flew 73 combat missions during her deployment, and 72 of them followed standard procedures without incident or innovation. But it was Mission 73 that people remembered, Mission 73 that defined her reputation, Mission 73 that would follow her through the rest of her career like a call sign that couldn't be changed. She didn't resent it. Resentment required caring about things beyond her control, and Iris had long ago learned to focus her energy on factors she could influence. Her skills, her decisions, her aircraft's maintenance, her readiness for whatever came next. What other people thought about her competence was their concern, not hers. She'd let her performance speak for itself, and if that performance occasionally involved landing in canyons to pull out casualties, then that was simply what the mission required. Her deployment ended in February, rotation back to the United States scheduled with the administrative precision that characterized all military movements. She packed her gear, cleaned her quarters, said brief goodbyes to crew chiefs and fellow pilots who'd shared her deployment cycle. Ramirez, the crew chief who'd assessed her battle damage, found her before she left. "Captain, it's been an honor maintaining your bird. Whatever squadron gets you next, they're getting someone special." Iris shook his hand, grip firm, eye contact direct. "I just fly them, Ramirez. You and your team keep them flying. That's where the real work happens." He smiled, recognizing the deflection for what it was, appreciating it anyway. "Ma'am, with all respect, what you did in that canyon wasn't just flying, but I hear you. Stay safe out there." She nodded, grabbed her bags, and walked toward the transport that would begin her journey home, leaving behind the dust and heat and mission tempo that had defined her last 9 months. The United States felt strange after Afghanistan, too clean and too loud, and too full of people who had no idea what was happening in places they couldn't pronounce. Iris processed back through her home station, completed the required medical screenings and psychological evaluations and administrative procedures that transformed deployed warriors back into peacetime soldiers. The psychologist asked about stress, about traumatic experiences, about how she was adjusting to being home. Iris answered honestly. Deployment was stressful but manageable. She'd experienced combat but maintained perspective. Adjustment was proceeding normally. The psychologist noted her responses, asked a few follow-up questions about the canyon incident specifically. "How did you feel when you decided to land in hostile territory to evacuate casualties?" Iris thought about that, about the question underneath the question, about what answer the psychologist expected versus what answer was true. "I felt focused. The situation required action. I had the capability to act. Emotion wasn't relevant to the decision matrix. The psychologist made notes, asked several more questions, eventually cleared Iris for return to full duty with no restrictions. As she left, the psychologist offered one final observation. Captain, most people who do what you did experience significant emotional responses, either during the event or afterward. Fear, euphoria, relief, something. Your ability to compartmentalize is remarkable, but make sure you're processing these experiences, not just cataloging them. Iris considered that advice, thanked the psychologist for her concern, and promptly forgot about it because there were flight evaluations to complete and proficiency standards to maintain, and the work of being an operational pilot didn't pause for introspection. She'd process her experiences the way she always had, by flying, by improving, by preparing for the next mission that would demand everything she'd learned from the previous ones. That was the only processing that mattered, the only reflection that produced results. Everything else was conversation that substituted for action, and Iris had never been particularly interested in conversation. Her new assignment was Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, home to multiple A-10 squadrons, and a culture that revered the warthog the way some communities revered churches. If you flew A-10s, Davis-Monthan was home, the place where ground attack doctrine was refined and close air support tactics were developed, and pilots who loved the ugly, lethal, beautiful aircraft gathered to compare notes and push boundaries. Iris reported for duty on a March morning, the Arizona sun already promising heat that would make summer memorable. The squadron commander was Colonel Sarah Chen, a name Iris recognized from professional publications and tactical discussions. Chen had 200 combat hours in the A-10, a reputation for demanding excellence, and a tendency to evaluate pilots based solely on their performance rather than their politics or popularity. She looked at Iris with eyes that suggested she'd already reviewed every detail of her record, including Afghanistan. Captain Vane, welcome to the 357th. I've read your file. Impressive work in theater. Iris stood at attention, offering appropriate acknowledgement without elaboration. Chen continued. I'm assigning you to lead a new training initiative focused on high-risk close air support tactics. We've been operating under standard procedures for decades, but your Canyon operation demonstrated that sometimes standard procedures are insufficient for non-standard circumstances. I want you to develop a curriculum that teaches pilots when and how to deviate from doctrine safely. It was both recognition and challenge, acknowledgement of what Iris had proven and expectation that she'd translate individual achievement into institutional improvement. She'd be teaching other pilots to think the way she thought, to assess risk with the same calculus that had led her to land in hostile terrain. The responsibility was significant. The opportunity was exactly what she'd wanted without knowing she wanted it. Understood, ma'am. When do I start? Chen almost smiled. Yesterday. But we'll settle for this afternoon. Dismissed. Iris saluted, left the office, and felt something she'd rarely experienced in military contexts, anticipation that extended beyond the next mission into possibility for sustained impact. Teaching was different from flying, required different skills, demanded different kinds of patience. Iris discovered she had less natural aptitude for instruction than for aviation, struggled initially with translating instincts that felt obvious into explanations that helped others understand. How do you teach someone to assess terrain at speed, to calculate landing feasibility while under fire, to balance mission requirements against aircraft limitations? The answers felt intuitive to her, born from thousands of hours making similar assessments in varying conditions. But intuition couldn't be transferred directly. It had to be deconstructed, analyzed, rebuilt into frameworks that other pilots could learn and apply. She worked with instructional designers, studied pedagogical methods, interviewed pilots about their decision-making processes. Slowly, painfully, she assembled a curriculum that captured some of what she'd learned. It wasn't perfect. Teaching never captured everything that experience contained, but it was effective, and effective was what mattered. Pilots who completed her course demonstrated improved judgment in complex tactical scenarios, showed greater confidence in high-risk environments, and most importantly, understood that rules existed to enable mission success, not to prevent creative problem-solving. 6 months into teaching, Iris flew her first training mission with a student who reminded her uncomfortably of herself. Technically proficient, tactically aggressive, and completely uninterested in recognition beyond performance metrics. Lieutenant Jake Morrison had graduated at the top of his training class, volunteered immediately for A-10s when most new pilots wanted faster, newer aircraft, and attacked every training scenario with intensity that sometimes exceeded judgment. Iris watched him on their first flight, saw him push boundaries that shouldn't be pushed yet, recognized the confidence that preceded either excellence or disaster depending on whether it was coupled with wisdom. After they landed, she pulled him aside for a conversation that felt both necessary and familiar. "Morrison, you've got skills, natural talent for the aircraft, good instincts for weapons employment, but you're flying like someone who thinks confidence replaces experience. It doesn't. Confidence gets you in position, experience gets you home." Morrison bristled slightly, the way young pilots always bristled when senior aviators questioned their competence. "Ma'am, I completed every training objective within parameters. My weapons delivery was accurate. My pattern work was—" Iris cut him off gently. "Your pattern work was adequate and your aggression was excessive. You flew through windows that exist but shouldn't be used until you understand why they exist. I'm not questioning your skills, Morrison. I'm questioning your judgment about when to use them." She let that sit for a moment, watching him process criticism that was both specific and impossible to argue against. Then she continued, voice softer. "I know what you're thinking because I thought it too. You think caution is for pilots who lack your talent, that rules exist because average aviators need guardrails. You're wrong. Rules exist because good aviators died learning lessons we don't want to relearn. Your job isn't to ignore those lessons. It's to master them so completely that when circumstances genuinely require deviation, you can do it safely." The conversation marked a shift in their working relationship. Morrison stopped treating training like a performance to ace and started approaching it like education to absorb. He asked better questions, listened more carefully to feedback, and gradually developed the kind of tactical judgment that couldn't be graded on a checklist but could be seen in how he approached problems. Iris watched his growth with satisfaction that felt both professional and personal, the satisfaction of seeing someone learn things she'd had to discover alone. Teaching wasn't flying, but teaching meant the next generation might fly better, might make better decisions, might survive circumstances that would have killed earlier aviators who lacked their training. That mattered. Maybe not in the same visceral way that close air support mattered, but in a way that compounded over time, that created ripples extending beyond individual missions into the broader culture of how pilots thought about their role. Iris began to suspect that teaching might be her most important contribution, more than medals or citations or legendary canyon landings. Legacy wasn't built in single moments. It was built in patterns of influence that changed how others approached their work. 2 years after Afghanistan, Iris received orders for her next deployment. Iraq this time, different theater but similar mission. Provide close air support for coalition ground forces engaged in counterinsurgency operations. The A-10 remained relevant in an era that preferred drones and precision weapons, because sometimes you needed a pilot overhead who could adapt in real time, who could distinguish between hostile and civilian in circumstances where algorithms would fail. Iris packed her gear with the same efficiency she brought to everything, said temporary goodbyes to students who'd become colleagues, and deployed to Al-Assad Air Base with expectations that were realistic about boredom punctuated by intensity. Combat was mostly waiting, occasionally dying, sometimes killing. She'd learned to appreciate the waiting, to use it for maintenance of skills and aircraft, to stay sharp during the long periods when nothing happened, so she'd be ready during the brief periods when everything happened simultaneously. Her first month in Iraq was entirely uneventful. She flew 32 missions, all of them routine overwatch, none requiring weapons employment, all following standard procedures that would generate no stories or recognition. Month 2 was different. Month 2 brought a mission that would remind everyone why Iris Vane's call sign was Hawkeye, why her reputation extended beyond a single canyon landing, why competence measured across years mattered more than heroism measured in moments. The tasking came at 3:40, the darkness absolute in the way that only desert darkness achieves. Kurdish forces were engaged in heavy contact with ISIS fighters in an urban environment 20 miles from the Syrian border. Multiple casualties, request for immediate close air support, complications including civilian population and friendly forces intermixed with hostile positions. Iris launched with full ordnance, climbed to altitude while absorbing the tactical situation from multiple radio frequencies, and arrived overhead to find chaos that required sorting before shooting. The Kurdish commander's English was good but stressed, his tactical description confused by circumstances that were legitimately confusing. Iris took control of the radio conversation with questions that were precise, direct, and designed to build a three-dimensional picture of the battlefield in her mind. Where exactly are your positions? Where exactly is enemy fire originating? What buildings contain civilians? The answers built a mental map that matched poorly with her sensor displays, suggesting either the commander's locations were approximate or the buildings had been misidentified. Iris descended to visual range, low enough that people on the ground could hear her engines, close enough that she could see muzzle flashes and movement patterns, and the difference between someone fleeing combat and someone engaging in it. Her targeting computer painted solutions. Her weapons system stood ready. But she didn't shoot, not yet, because the first rule of close air support was never deliver ordnance until you're absolutely certain of what you're hitting. She made 3 passes, each one drawing ground fire, each one refining her understanding of the tactical geometry. On the 4th pass, she saw it. A cluster of ISIS fighters had positioned themselves in a building complex that shared walls with occupied civilian structures, using human shields without actually hurting humans, just exploiting urban architecture that made precision bombing impossible for anyone who cared about civilian casualties. Standard doctrine said call for different weapons, request bunker busters or guided missiles that could thread through buildings. Standard doctrine was written for circumstances with time to coordinate. Iris analyzed vectors, angles, explosive radius of her ordnance. She ran calculations that balanced destructive necessity against collateral possibility, looking for the geometric solution that would kill enemies without killing innocents. And she found it, but it required weapons delivery from an approach angle that exposed her to ground fire from 3 sides, at an altitude that made anti-aircraft weapons effective, with margin for error measured in meters rather than tens of meters. She made one more pass to confirm her analysis, took fire that rattled against her titanium bathtub, confirmed that the shot was possible and therefore required. Kurdish forces, Hawkeye 7-1, I have solution on hostile position, stand by for immediate weapons delivery, keep all personnel in covered positions, danger close, over. The Kurdish commander acknowledged, voice carrying hope that came from understanding rescue was incoming. Iris rolled into her attack run with the precision of a surgeon and the commitment of someone who'd done this math 1,000 times. The Maverick missile left her aircraft, guided by laser designation she maintained despite ground fire, despite warnings from her threat detection systems, despite every instinct that said level off and gain altitude. The missile impacted exactly where intended, penetrating the specific building section she'd targeted, the explosion channeled by architecture into spaces occupied by fighters rather than families. The Kurdish commander's voice came back ecstatic with relief and gratitude. Hawkeye, Hawkeye, perfect shot, enemy position destroyed. You just saved us. Thank you, thank you. Iris acknowledged without emotion, already scanning for additional targets, already analyzing whether follow-up strikes were necessary. They weren't. The ISIS fighters who'd survived her precision were retreating, their defensive position compromised, their willingness to continue engagement evaporated by violence that was both targeted and overwhelming. She provided overwatch for another 40 minutes while Kurdish forces secured the area, then returned to base with ordnance expended and fuel state requiring direct approach. The debrief was routine. Successful mission, hostile casualties, 0 friendly casualties, 0 civilian casualties. The numbers documented success but missed the significance. IRIS had delivered close air support in urban terrain that made precision difficult and mistakes catastrophic, had threaded weapons through geometric constraints that would have caused other pilots to refuse the shot or request different capabilities. The Kurdish commander submitted a commendation through coalition channels, praising the American pilot who'd saved his unit with shooting that he described as impossible precision. The report made its way through command structures, adding another data point to Iris Vane's growing reputation as someone who could perform in circumstances that challenged other aviators. But Iris didn't think about reputation. She thought about the next mission, the next challenge, the next opportunity to apply skills she'd spent years developing. Recognition was nice. Results were what mattered. She'd achieved results. The Kurdish soldiers went home alive. The ISIS fighters didn't. The math was simple and sufficient. Everything else was noise that distracted from the fundamental purpose of her profession: deliver violence precisely to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. She'd done that. She'd do it again tomorrow if required. That was the job. That was enough. That was everything that mattered when you stripped away bureaucracy and politics and reputation and focused on the essential truth of what close air support meant. Someone on the ground needed help, someone in the air provided it, and the quality of that provision determined who lived and who died. The deployment continued through summer heat that made ground operations miserable and flight operations complicated by thermals that treated predictable ballistics like suggestions. Iris flew 96 combat missions during her 6-month rotation, employed weapons on 11 of them, returned safely from all of them with aircraft damage ranging from none to moderate. She developed a reputation among ground forces as the pilot you requested when the situation was complicated, when precision mattered more than firepower, when civilian considerations made standard approaches insufficient. Her call sign became synonymous with competence, with reliability, with the kind of professional excellence that didn't require dramatics because capability spoke for itself. She mentored younger pilots who deployed to her base, sharing lessons learned with the same directness she brought to combat missions. Some of them absorbed her teaching eagerly. Others found her style too spare, too focused on technique rather than inspiration. She didn't adjust her approach for either group. People learned differently. Her job was to provide information. Their job was to extract value from it. When her deployment ended, she returned to Davis-Monthan and resumed teaching duties that had expanded during her absence. The training program she developed had proven successful enough that it was being incorporated into formal A-10 curricula, her methods becoming standard instruction for pilots throughout the close air support community. Colonel Chen called her in for review 3 weeks after her return. "Captain Vane, I'm promoting you to major and assigning you as the Director of Tactical Development for the squadron. You'll continue teaching but also shape doctrine for how we approach high-complexity close air support scenarios. Congratulations." The promotion was expected, the assignment was significant, and Iris received both with the same measured response she brought to most recognitions. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm honored by your confidence." Chen smiled slightly. "Confidence has nothing to do with it. This is about capability. You've demonstrated repeatedly that you can perform in circumstances that challenge conventional approaches. Now I need you to teach others to do the same, and to help us formalize when and how we deviate from standard procedure safely." The work was satisfying in ways that surprised her. Iris had always thought of herself as a pilot first, an instructor second, an administrator never. But developing doctrine required analytical skills she possessed in abundance, demanded precision thinking she'd honed through countless missions, and created opportunity for impact that extended beyond individual sorties into the broader culture of how close air support was conceptualized and executed. She worked with other tacticians, studied historical missions, analyzed contemporary operations, and slowly assembled frameworks that captured lessons learned across decades of combat aviation. The frameworks weren't revolutionary. Revolutionary rarely worked in military contexts where lives depended on tested procedures. But they were evolutionary, expanding the boundaries of what pilots understood as possible while maintaining safety parameters that prevented evolution from becoming recklessness. Other squadrons adopted her frameworks. Training commands incorporated her methods. And slowly, the broader A-10 community began approaching close air support with greater flexibility, greater creativity, and greater confidence in circumstances that required deviation from standard approaches. 3 years after the canyon, Iris received notification that a book was being published about modern close air support operations, and that her Afghanistan mission would be featured prominently. The author, a retired Air Force officer turned military historian, had interviewed her extensively, gathered testimony from the SEALs she'd saved, and assembled a narrative that was both accurate and hagiographic in ways that made Iris uncomfortable. She read the relevant chapter before publication, found no factual errors but considerable interpretive excess, and declined the author's request to participate in promotional activities. She didn't need her story amplified. The mission had happened, the results spoke for themselves, and additional attention served no purpose except feeding narratives about heroism that missed the essential point. She'd been trained, equipped, and positioned to provide support, and she'd done so competently. Heroism implied something exceptional. What she'd done was simply competent execution of responsibilities she'd accepted when she became a combat pilot. The author was disappointed by her refusal, but published anyway, and the book became moderately successful in military aviation circles, introducing new audiences to the story of Hawkeye 7-1. Publicity created complications Iris hadn't anticipated. Journalists requested interviews. Television producers wanted to feature her story in documentary programs. Aviation enthusiasts wanted autographs and photos. She declined everything with polite firmness, explaining that she was an active duty officer with duties that precluded public engagement, thanking people for their interest while redirecting it toward the broader close air support community rather than individual pilots. Most accepted her refusals gracefully. A few persisted with intensity that bordered on harassment. One journalist, particularly aggressive in seeking access, finally provoked a response that Iris would later regret for its bluntness if not its honesty. "I'm not interested in being a story. I'm interested in being competent. Those are different objectives and I've chosen mine. Please stop contacting me." The journalist published an article about her refusal, spinning it as false modesty or media shyness, completely missing the actual motivation. Iris understood that becoming a public figure would compromise her effectiveness as an operational pilot, and effectiveness mattered more than fame. The years accumulated with the steady rhythm of military careers, deployments and returns, missions and training, promotions and responsibilities. Iris made lieutenant colonel at age 34, younger than typical but not unprecedented given her combat record and demonstrated leadership. She commanded her own squadron, led training initiatives that shaped how the entire A-10 community approached tactical challenges, and mentored pilots who would go on to their own distinguished careers. She flew less as her rank increased, administrative duties consuming time she'd have preferred to spend airborne, but she maintained proficiency through disciplined practice and regular training flights that kept her skills sharp. At age 38, she deployed to Syria for what would be her final combat rotation, providing close air support for special operations forces engaged in counterterrorism missions against remnant extremist groups. The deployment was harder than previous ones. her body less resilient to sleep deprivation and environmental stress, her patience thinner for bureaucratic obstacles that interfered with mission effectiveness. But her skills remained sharp, her judgment sound, and her ability to deliver precision support in complex circumstances undiminished by age or fatigue. It was during that deployment that she flew her most personally significant mission, though nobody would write books about it or submit it for commendations. A small special operations team was conducting surveillance on a high-value target in a remote village, their position compromised by circumstances that were unclear but irrelevant. They needed immediate extract, enemy forces converging, evacuation helicopters 12 minutes out. Iris provided overwatch, circling above while monitoring radio traffic and sensor feeds, ready to engage if hostile forces appeared. But they didn't appear. The team extracted successfully, helicopters arrived on time, mission accomplished without a single shot fired. Afterward, the team leader radioed direct thanks to Hawkeye 7-1 for keeping them safe. Iris acknowledged briefly, already thinking about her next tasking, and only later reflected on what that mission meant. She'd flown for 2 hours, burned fuel, employed 0 weapons, generated 0 dramatic outcomes, and contributed to success through simple presence. That was close air support in its purest form, being where you were needed, ready to deliver violence that hopefully wouldn't be required, present as capability rather than action. She thought about all her missions, all the different forms success could take, all the ways competence manifested beyond dramatic moments. The canyon would always be her most famous mission, but it wasn't her best mission. Her best missions were the ones where she prevented problems rather than solving them, where presence deterred engagement, where capability meant violence became unnecessary. Those missions generated no stories, no citations, no legendary status. They just generated successful outcomes for people who went home safely because someone competent was overhead ready to help if needed. That was the real work of close air support. That was the real measure of professional success. And Iris took more pride in those unmemorable missions than in all the dramatic ones combined, because they represented consistency rather than exception, pattern rather than deviation, professional excellence measured across careers rather than moments. When she returned from Syria, she knew it would be her last deployment, not because she couldn't perform, but because the Air Force needed her experience in positions that shaped how younger pilots would approach their work. She was promoted to colonel at 41, assigned to command at Nellis Air Force Base, where tactical development and weapons school operations refined the art and science of attack aviation. It was fitting symmetry. She'd begun her career at Nellis as a student. She'd returned to end it as a commander, teaching others the lessons she'd learned across 17 years of operational flying. Her assumption of command speech was characteristically brief. She thanked her predecessors, acknowledged her staff, and then spoke directly to the pilots who'd be under her leadership. Your job is to be so good that when Americans need close air support, their survival is certain rather than hopeful. That requires excellence in every aspect of your profession: flying, weapons employment, tactical judgment, and character. Excellence isn't occasional. It's the standard you maintain every day, every mission, every decision. I expect it from myself. I'll expect it from you. Let's get to work. The speech was remembered for its directness, its clarity, and its complete absence of inspirational rhetoric or emotional appeal. Under Iris's command, Nellis became known for producing close air support pilots whose competence was matched only by their confidence, who understood that rules existed to enable mission success rather than prevent creative problem-solving, who could operate effectively in circumstances ranging from conventional to chaos. She established training protocols that pushed pilots into scenarios where standard procedures were insufficient, forcing them to develop judgment that exceeded checklist thinking. She demanded precision in weapons employment that made perfect acceptable and excellent expected. She mentored younger officers with the same spare directness she'd brought to everything, offering feedback that was specific, actionable, and sometimes brutally honest. Some thrived under her leadership, Others requested transfers, finding her expectations exhausting and her style cold. She accepted both outcomes without adjustment to her approach. Leadership wasn't about being liked. Leadership was about developing capability in those under your command. If her methods produced capable pilots, they were successful regardless of how those pilots felt about her personally. At age 46, Iris attended a ceremony she tried to decline, but was ordered to participate in: the dedication of a new training facility at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, named the Vane Tactical Development Center in recognition of her contributions to close air support doctrine and training methodology. The naming was unprecedented for a living officer, typically reserved for legends whose careers had concluded. But the Air Force Chief of Staff had personally approved it, noting that Iris Vane's influence on modern attack aviation merited recognition while she could witness it. The ceremony was attended by hundreds, including many of the pilots she'd trained, the SEALs she'd saved in Afghanistan 20 years prior, and colleagues from across her career. She stood at the podium, looking at assembled faces, feeling deeply uncomfortable with a tension she'd spent decades deflecting. Her speech was brief. "I'm honored by this recognition, though I remain unconvinced I deserve it more than hundreds of other pilots who have served with similar dedication. If this facility helps produce even marginally better close air support aviators, then perhaps the honor serves a purpose beyond flattering my ego. Thank you for attending. Now let's get back to work." The SEALs approached her after the ceremony. They were older now. Marcus Briggs retired and teaching at a private security academy, Sullivan working as a contractor in Africa. Anderson passed away from cancer 2 years prior, but remembered through stories his team shared. They wanted to thank her again, wanted her to know the canyon remained their most vivid memory across careers filled with combat operations. Briggs spoke for the group. "Ma'am, we've worked with hundreds of pilots across multiple continents. You're the only one we talk about still, the only one whose name we remember without checking records. What you did that day defined what close air support could be at its absolute best: personal, precise, and committed beyond what duty technically required. Thank you for that. Thank you for showing us what's possible when someone truly excellent is in position to help." Iris accepted their thanks, uncomfortable as always with gratitude that felt disproportionate to actions she considered professional obligation. But she also understood their need to express it, understood that for them, the canyon represented more than tactical success. It represented proof that the military kept its promises about never leaving warriors behind, that support would come when needed, that competence and commitment could overcome circumstance. She retired from active duty at 48, 30 years of service completed with a record that included 4,000 flight hours, 6 combat deployments, 317 combat missions, an influence on close air support doctrine that would extend decades beyond her career. Her retirement ceremony was appropriately formal, attended by officers whose careers she'd shaped and pilots whose lives she'd likely saved through training that made them better than they would have been without her influence. The commanding general of Air Combat Command presented her with final recognition, summarizing a career that could be measured in medals but mattered more in impact. "Colonel Vane, you've been many things during your service: pilot, instructor, tactician, commander, and legend, whether you accept that designation or not. But fundamentally, you've been an example of what happens when exceptional skill meets unwavering commitment to mission. The Air Force is better because you served. Combat aviation is better because you flew. And warriors are alive today because when they needed help, you were overhead ready to provide it. Thank you for your service." Iris's retirement didn't mean disconnection from aviation. She accepted a position as a civilian consultant, working with defense contractors on next-generation close air support systems, providing input on everything from aircraft design to weapons integration to pilot interface requirements. Her expertise was valued specifically because it came from extensive operational experience rather than engineering theory or marketing projection. She knew what worked because she'd used it in circumstances where failure meant death. That knowledge shaped development processes, influenced design decisions, and ensured that new capabilities reflected operational reality rather than abstract possibility. She also taught occasionally at the Air Force Academy, guest lectures on tactical decision-making that were legendarily challenging and equally valuable. Cadets who wanted inspiration got assigned to different speakers. Cadets who wanted to actually learn received Iris Vane, who would spend 90 minutes explaining how to assess terrain at speed, calculate weapons effects under stress, and make decisions that balanced mission accomplishment against acceptable risk. Some cadets hated her sessions. Others considered them the most valuable instruction they received. 25 years after the canyon, a documentary filmmaker tracked down Iris at her home in Nevada, seeking permission to create a comprehensive film about her career and legacy. The filmmaker was young, earnest, and completely unprepared for the response. Iris listened to the entire pitch, acknowledged it was well-researched and thoughtfully presented, and then declined completely. "I appreciate your interest, but I'm not interested in being documented. I was a pilot. I did my job competently across multiple decades. That's the entire story. Everything else is interpretation and emphasis that serves narrative construction rather than accurate representation. I'd rather be remembered by people who flew with me, fought beside me, or learned from me than by audiences who think they know me because they watched 90 minutes of edited footage." The filmmaker tried several counterarguments, eventually retreating with disappointment but without footage. Years later, that filmmaker would tell people that Iris Vane's refusal was somehow more compelling than agreement would have been, that her commitment to being defined by work rather than publicity was itself a lesson in professional integrity. Iris lived quietly in retirement, flying occasionally for recreation in a vintage aircraft she'd restored personally, consulting when defense contractors needed operational perspective, teaching when the academy requested her expertise. She maintained contact with a small circle of colleagues from her operational years, gathering occasionally to share stories that would seem implausible to anyone who hadn't lived similar experiences. At one such gathering, Sullivan asked her the question everyone had wondered about for decades. "Iris, looking back on everything, on all the missions and all the outcomes, what do you think about most?" She considered that, looking at faces that had aged alongside hers, thinking about years compressed into moments and moments expanded into careers. "I think about the ones I brought home. The SEALs, the Special Operations Teams, the ground forces who needed support and received it precisely when required. I think about the pilots I trained who went on to save others because they'd learned lessons I could teach them. I think about systems I helped design that will make future close air support more effective. I don't think about medals or recognition or that damn canyon that everyone wants to talk about. I think about whether I left things better than I found them." I think the answer is yes, that's sufficient. On a spring morning in Nevada, when Iris was 71 years old, she took her restored aircraft for a flight over terrain she'd flown above thousands of times. The sky was clear, the air smooth, the visibility unlimited. She flew alone, as she preferred, following no particular route toward no specific destination, simply experiencing the fundamental joy of flight that had defined her adult life. Somewhere over the desert, at an altitude where the world below became pattern rather than detail, she thought about all of it. The canyon, the missions, the students, the doctrine, the career, the life spent in service of something larger than herself. And she felt no regret, no wishing she'd chosen differently, no wondering about paths not taken. She'd been a pilot. She'd been excellent at it. She'd used that excellence to protect people who needed protecting and teach people who needed teaching. Everything else was commentary. Below her, the Nevada desert stretched endlessly, beautiful and harsh and indifferent to human stories. Above her, the sky held space for anyone with skill and courage enough to claim it. And between earth and sky, Iris Vane flew on, carrying legacy measured not in recognition but in impact, not in fame but in the countless lives that continued because she'd been overhead when needed, ready to help, committed to excellence, defined by competence rather than acclaim. That was her story, that was enough, that was everything that mattered.